Why does the United States tolerate Russia's annexation of eastern Ukraine? Did he really win? Why should we support Ukraine at this moment? This video will provide the answer. Many believe that the US tolerating Russia's annexation is a policy of appeasement. But if he thinks so, it indicates a misunderstanding of the essence of Russia-Europe relations and underestimates the US. Once Russia annexes Ukraine, Europe will be the loser. Russia will be the loser. Only the US will be the winner. Why? Because the US has never wanted Russia and Europe to get too close. If Europe and Russia unite, it will create a super economy across the Eurasian continent. This is unacceptable for the US. After World War II, the global landscape appeared to be a US-Soviet rivalry. But the real competition was between the US and Europe. The US's biggest rival is not the Soviet Union, but Europe. Europe's economic strength has always matched that of the US. In some years, it even surpassed the US. At the height of the Soviet Union, its GDP was only about 70% of that of the US. Before the Internet revolution, Europe had a significant technological advantage over the US. In contrast, the Soviet Union, besides its heavy industry, was almost useless in other sectors. The reason the US can control Europe is geopolitical security. Europe has a major shortcoming: geopolitics and military. Geopolitically, Western Europe is flat, with no defenses. Soviet armored forces could sweep through from Poland and East Germany in just 1 month. Thus, Western Europe has always feared being pushed into the sea by Soviet troops. This dependence on US military protection was extreme. However, after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the situation reversed. Russia's power was weakened, and the EU had the strength to resist Russia without US assistance. More importantly, after the Soviet collapse, many buffer states emerged between Europe and Russia. This alleviated Europe's worries about a rapid Russian attack. If Russia and Europe unite, even the US would feel threatened. Thus, since the 1990s, Europe has sought to assert its independence. The EU was officially established, and the euro was introduced, challenging the dollar's dominance. The euro's rise caused the dollar index to fall from around 120 to about 80 in 2008. This marked a historical low. In the same year, the euro hit a record of 1.6 against the dollar. To counter Europe and maintain the dollar, the US began NATO's eastward expansion, re-establishing the threat from Russia. Through NATO's expansion, the US forced Russia to confront the EU. Later, Ukraine became central to the US strategy of driving a wedge between Russia and Europe. If Ukraine can be dealt with, the strategic buffer between Russia and Europe will vanish. This is also why former German Chancellor Merkel is called the last statesman of Europe. She always prioritized national interests over ideological opposition. Opposition is just opposition. German purchases of Russian natural gas continued unabated. Under Merkel's leadership, Germany and Russia constructed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and Ukraine's NATO aspirations were repeatedly blocked by Merkel. After Merkel left, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine erupted. Ukraine is the last strategic buffer between Russia and Europe. Russia cannot relinquish it. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was the region of highest economic value. Its population density is the highest. Additionally, Ukraine possesses some of the most fertile land on Earth. Being one of the 3 major black soil regions, Ukraine occupies only 3% of the Soviet territory. It produces more than 1/3 of the Soviets' grain output. At times, it even accounted for 40%. With Ukraine, the Soviet Union could sustain 300 million people. Without Ukraine, Russia can only sustain 150 million. Moreover, the only warm water port of the Soviet Union is located in Ukraine. Additionally, Ukraine is also one of the cradles of Russian civilization. Kievan Rus from 882 AD is the ancestor of Russia. Without Ukraine, Russia will never be able to become a global superpower again. It is hard to imagine how the US would decline if it lost the Mississippi River Basin or the wealth of Jiangsu and Zhejiang. The reason Russia hasn't annexed Ukraine is to maintain the strategic buffer with the EU. The US once promised that NATO would not expand eastward. However, this was proven false. NATO expanded anyway. Historically, maintaining harmonious relations between two great powers requires strategic buffers. Mongolia serves as a buffer between China and Russia. During the Cold War, the Soviet-controlled Mongolia could allow Soviet troops to reach Beijing within a week. Thus, the Sino-Soviet relationship deteriorated inevitably. After the Soviet collapse, Soviet troops withdrew from Mongolia, which became a buffer state between China and Russia. Thus, China and Russia could develop an all-weather strategic partnership. Similarly, Nepal serves as a buffer between India and China. The tenuous peace between China and India has been maintained. The important reason lies in the presence of Nepal and Bhutan as strategic buffer states. Ukraine serves as a strategic buffer between Russia and Europe. As long as Ukraine remains a buffer state, there is a possibility for peaceful coexistence between Russia and Europe. However, as Ukraine leans towards the west, it might join NATO at any time. At this point, Russia can only seize Crimea to preserve its Black Sea Fleet. This is a matter of life and death for Russia. The biggest winner in the Crimea crisis is the United States. It successfully disrupted the cooperation between Russia and Europe. This made the European Union once again a subordinate to the US. The real loser is the European Union, which gained no substantial benefits. It had to interrupt trade with Russia. Not only that, the European Union will again become the front line of US-Russia confrontation. It suffers while others profit. The euro has depreciated from its peak of 1.6 in 2008. It has now fallen below €1, which is the true goal of US suppression of the EU. Moreover, the goal of the Earth is clear. It knows that annexing Ukraine does not align with Russia's current interests. Thus, Russia's attitude towards Ukraine is simply two words: gradually encroaching on eastern Ukraine. Its invasion of the West is an invasion of Europe. So, for Russia, the best strategy is to gradually encroach on eastern Ukraine. First, instigating the eastern states of Ukraine to declare independence and later join Russia. So, one can see the calculations of the United States. The US is not afraid of Russia taking action. In fact, after the Russia-Ukraine war begins, the biggest loser is actually Europe. The US homeland will not suffer any shelling, and funds will flow back to the US in large amounts. The US can take the opportunity to harvest wealth from Europe. So in the long run, Ukraine will eventually become a division similar to East and West Germany. Eastern Ukraine joining Russia, Western Ukraine joining NATO. Europe will again see a state of confrontation reminiscent of the Cold War. If Ukraine is dismembered or annexed, the EU will have only two choices. The first is to allow Germany to rearm. Only Germany has the most abundant military resources. The second is to increase military dependence on the US. The cost will be the loss of political and economic independence. Most EU member states may choose to align with the US due to the risks of rearming Germany being too high. After all, the Third Reich is gone. No one wants another Fourth Reich. But military dependence will inevitably lead to the EU being politically and economically dominated by the US. The euro, as a manifestation of European independence, may collapse. Even the EU itself may be dismantled. After the collapse of the euro, the dollar index may rise again. Many quality European companies may be acquired at low prices by US firms. For the East, there are pros and cons. The benefits are: it will create a window of opportunity to recover Taiwan. After the emergence of the sixth-generation fighter, the US relying solely on the 7th Fleet and the Japanese and American forces will be insufficient to counter the East. They would have to abandon the first island chain. At that time, unifying Taiwan would truly be a manageable task. But the downside is, they must face a completely pro-US EU. In the past 20 years, Europe's restrictions on the East have been much less than those of the US. The economic relationship with China has remained relatively stable. However, if the EU loses its buffer state with Russia in the future, the EU will inevitably rely militarily on the US, thus completely losing its autonomy. This means that in the future, the East will not only face US encirclement, but also the encirclement of the entire West. Once the EU submits, the US will have the conditions to initiate a new Cold War. At that time, the world may form a coalition of the East: Russia, Iran against the US, Europe, Japan, India facing enormous geopolitical pressure. Thus, at this time, the East must support Europe, support Ukraine. Russia and Europe must not unite. However, the EU must not completely lean towards the US. In the future, Ukraine is likely to replicate the situation of East and West Germany. Europe will once again become the front line of war. Like and follow the tavern. Strategic ambiguity. I will help you clarify.